The country is also taking steps to limit the number of foreign students as part of a broader effort to rein in surging immigration. Critics say the plan risks crimping universities' revenues, potentially hurting global rankings. Bloomberg's Paul Allen has more from Sydney.
International students are a fixture of Australian universities. After a sharp slowdown during the pandemic, they've returned in force, with 700,000 arriving in February. A staggering 1 in every 33 people in Australia is here to study. Tertiary education has become a river of gold, worth $32 billion in exports last year, trailing only iron ore, coal and gas. However, those students also need somewhere to live, and are now in the crosshairs of a broader political debate over migration and housing. The government is proposing a cap on student numbers. The exact numbers not yet known, but the idea has bipartisan support. The peak body representing Australia's universities is accusing both major political parties of using foreign students as scapegoats ahead of an election due next year.
Using students as cannon fodder in a poll-driven battle over migration and housing simply doesn't add up.
The universities have a strong motivation to preserve the status quo. Highly ranked schools, including the University of Melbourne and University of New South Wales, rely on international students for a third of their revenue. That income stream would dry up, and they argue research funding would dry up along with it. Paul Allen, Bloomberg, Sydney.
Joining us now is Elizabeth Collett, who's a Global Fellow at the Migration Policy Institute. She's also a member of Australia's Ministerial Advisory Council on Skilled Migration. Elizabeth, great to have you with us. And as you allude to, there are sort of multitudes to this debate, right? Whether you're looking at this from an inflation, a dwelling inflation or overall inflation point of view, from a growth point of view, with this being, of course, such a massive component of GDP growth for Australia and for labour market and productivity. Do you think the debate is being framed correctly and accurately at this point?
Well, Australia is not the only country having this conversation. You've seen similar spikes in numbers of international students, not just post-pandemic, as those who couldn't come to study arrived when the borders reopened, but also because numbers of international students in, say, the big four across, that's the US, Canada, Australia, and the UK, have increased significantly over the last decade. So bigger questions are being asked about the sustainability of this as an industry, the credibility of the education outcomes if there is that huge growth and that huge contribution, and also, you know, how will universities fund themselves if they're not able to use international students. So there are bigger questions about the shape of the industry long term. And I think part of the challenge here is whether that conversation has taken place before these policies have been put on the table, with a focus on cutting net overseas migration rather than thinking about the shape overall of the international education sector and what that means for Australia, both in terms of an export industry, but also as a source of human capital development and the future skills workforce of Australia.
It sounds like perhaps you're more concerned and focused on the issue of credibility and higher education standards, right? And maybe if rules need to be tightened around those elements. Do you think there is scapegoating going on when it comes to blaming immigration and students in particular for the contribution to broader inflation and cost of living concerns?
So it's a really complex issue, and I think one of the challenges is that students have very, very specific impacts on housing in particular areas of university campuses, but there are broader housing constraints across Australia. So how do you think about where those interactions take place? Students also have an enormous contribution to make to the local economy in their own consumption and can be a job creator both within universities and in those localities. So there is a positive contribution of students, which I think is broadly recognised across Australia, that having international students is a good thing. The policies that have been so far put in place by the Australian government have focused much more on the credibility of the industry, raising language standards, for example, amongst applicants, taking a closer look at higher risk providers where they're not sure of the quality of the education being provided, and putting higher fees in place that are designed to sort of dampen demand towards those who are more committed to the objective of getting an education. Those things are meant to shape the industry a little more towards making sure it retains that credibility and that outlook. The cap that's now being proposed is a little more of a blunt instrument that is designed to sort of limit and impact net overseas migration overall. And for universities used to planning years ahead and thinking through their research objectives and how they manage their budgets, putting something in so quickly may have an outsized impact, certainly on those economies that are most deeply dependent on international students.
Are we going to see an eventual impact when it comes to university rankings?
I think it's too early to look at university rankings. You're also seeing quite significant policy changes happening in other countries. So, for example, Canada put its own cap in place a few months ago. The UK has changed rules to limit the number of dependents, that is, family members who are able to join students. And these are having their own impacts on how many people are going to some of those bigger markets across the world. So it'll take some time to really figure out how that's going to shift, and particularly with the US election coming up and uncertainty about whether a change in administration would lead to a change in rules over international students. I think it's too early to tell what will happen to the overall rankings, but you are seeing newer entrants into the international education industry. Some European countries have seen growth in the number of international students in the last year or so, having dampened down themselves during the mid-2010s. In Germany, France, Sweden, Netherlands have all seen increases. And some emerging countries that haven't necessarily have large international student populations, but have seen significant growth. Philippines, Chile, Argentina will be examples of those. So it might be that there is less focus on the big four and a more diversification of the trends, but I think it's too early to tell what those impacts will be. Governments tend to panic when the numbers are too high.
So when it comes to this blunt tool by Australian authorities, what does that mean in terms of the composition of international students that we could see in the future?
Well, the previous set of policies were really designed to look at lower quality education providers and didn't really affect the so-called group of 8 in Australia, the top universities. The cap would then theoretically affect those universities more. So it would be a much more of across the board cap. And that would then, I think, impact the ability of those universities to invest in future research, invest in teaching, loss of jobs. So there are, I think, some genuine concerns from the education providers that they haven't had time to really think about what this means or adjust for it or make their own, I think, their own planning that would help for this. They will just see a shortfall in the next year. So I think you will see an impact on all levels of education providers should this come into effect.